Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. Unfortunately, since we're still under COVID lockdown, I'm actually completely out of beer for this. I'm out of most things. I'm eating like leftover salad out of my fridge right now. So it's a little bit funny right now, but I am very excited to have Mina Markham on the podcast today. She's a design systems advocate. She works as a staff software engineer at Slack, and she's formerly of the Hillary for America campaign. Mina, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry you ran out of beer. That's unfortunate.
It's a crazy world. Getting to the grocery store is like an hour line for us in our neighborhood because we're kind of like this funny part that there's not a lot of grocery around us. So rather than sit and stand in line, I've been running to the mini mart on beer runs occasionally. But you can only do so many of those before like the social distancing guilt gets to you. You know,
I haven't been going out very much at all in this like era of social distancing. I've gone out exactly 2 times since it began, and I felt extreme anxiety and guilt when I did those 2 times, even though they were both going to the doctor, which is supposed to be allowed and encouraged. But,
right.
It's just, it feels like such a weird world outside now.
No, it's a crazy time, right? The block radius within my house is very well worn. Like I have a 2-year-old, and so me and the 2-year-old have been like pushing his toys in the same track around the neighborhood for like a month now. Yeah. So I think we're all getting a little stir crazy.
Yeah, I feel you on that.
Just to kick us off, I know you're a huge Beyoncé fan, and so I wanted to set the record straight. When you get those Slack pings that include Beyoncé from your team with your trigger words, what's your favorite one of those that you
Unfortunately, because I work with a bunch of trolls, the pings I get are never actually about anything. It literally is just the word Beyoncé, just the name Beyoncé, simply to get my attention. They're not saying anything about her. They're not saying anything relevant. It's just like, hey, let's just see if Mina will show up. Hey, look, she did show up.
It's like the summoning word for your presence.
It is. They love to mess with me using highlight words, which don't ever reveal your highlight words to your fellow teammates or anyone you share a Slack space with. Just don't do it, because you don't know who you can trust.
That's an official engineering comment about Slack and the highlight words
are sacred. They're sacred.
Well, hey, we're here to talk about design systems, and I loved your event Aparta talk back in December about the mythical creatures and the way that they interact to create these beautiful things we call design systems. I think that it's wonderful how you are so adamant about the need for design systems concepts to end up in a roadmap, to be treated like a product, to be thought of like a product inside of an organization. But one of the things that is decidedly absent in a lot of our conversations about design systems is this idea of how you do research and how you gather metrics about the success of your design system. And I wanted to chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, like a lot of people, when we talk about design systems, they kind of focus on, we can talk more about this later, but focus a lot on the component aspect of it, or like the actual like UI piece. And we don't talk about all these other more process oriented pieces, which are just as important. Gathering data actually is a great way to get people who are kind of peripherally involved in the design system to care and pay attention. A lot of the questions I get sometimes are around how do you get buy-in from like execs and people who you need their approval to start working on something like this. And the way you get their attention is with data. Like they pay attention to data. So there's data you can gather before you start working about the state of your UI as it exists right now, which is like giving a UI audit or interface inventory or something like that. On the code side, you can kind of show all the technical debt you've accumulated, and you can kind of go from there.
Interesting. So when you're doing an interface inventory, most of the time when I think about that, I think it back to, Brad's blog post from nearly a decade ago now or something, where he's talking about parts in the process of doing an interface inventory. And it's about shared language. It's about gathering these shared concepts and collecting these patterns together. You also use that to collect data about this system itself.
Yeah, I do sometimes. I use that. That was how I got the design director for the Hillary campaign sort of like truly interested and invested in the system. She was already basically on board, but once I showed her like the breadth of like UI drift that had occurred and kind of broke down like all the various different similar but slightly different pieces we had, it was kind of very eye-opening to see that. So it's also about like knowing your audience. Like if you're talking to a design oriented person, they may respond better to more visual like data, more visual stimulation, whereas if you're talking to a director of engineering or something, they probably want like more hard quantitative things, which that's kind of a stereotype and not like hard and fast rule, but it's kind of speaks to
Hmm.
the point of like knowing who you're talking to and know what best they would respond to.
Gotcha. So an engineering director is going to be caring about things like, number of software defects or number of one-offs or incursion of technical debt, whereas somebody that's on the design side is going to be a lot more curious about inconsistencies in the brand, like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that seems to be more of like what that individual role, like that's more of what their wheelhouse, and that's more of what they will probably respond to. Also, for process oriented things, you can kind of show how long it takes to put something together in the current system, and that's going to get your product people interested. It's going to get your product managers interested. It probably will get pretty much anyone who cares about efficiency and like deadlines and timelines interested by showing here's how long it takes us to accomplish a feature, a new feature, or a new page. And this is why all of these inconsistencies in the code and the UI and the process, this is what all this is kind of cumbersome and leading to a much longer timeline.
Interesting. So, when you talk about it at the level of a product owner, those are also a lot of people that are often authorized to spend money on stuff like this. And so a part of this is also proving the value to the organization with real data that you can show a change from your existing state to a new reality with a design system.
Yeah, the hard thing about showing the effectiveness is it's kind of hard to show the effectiveness without actually doing it. And a lot of people I've talked to, myself included, you kind of have to almost do it without permission in order to show how well it can work. Like you can start by maybe just doing one page or one small feature and streamlining that process end to end. And then you can show, like, hey, I did a similar feature like this a year ago and it took me X a number of sprints. And once we revamped this process, this feature took me only one sprint or whatever. Like, so it kind of sometimes it becomes a kind of cart before the horse kind of scenario where you have to do it under the radar to show how effective it can be and how it benefit and why they should invest in something like this.
Gotcha. So in that sort of like, crawl, walk, run kind of paradigm that you laid out there, what would you say to the people that feel like they're stuck in this crawl? There's a lot of teams that we talk to that they're trying really hard to prove out this initial little value through one page or one component or whatever, but it seems like they're having a hard time really getting that buy-in from the organization to make this broader, bigger than one product or bigger than one part of
It's
one
a
product.
tough question. There's not really like a hard, true answer to it. I've been kind of fortunate in my career where whenever I've worked on one of these, I've already had the implicit like approval of the people who are above me. But lately, I've been having a hard time like carving out specific time to maintain and to further grow the design system that I'm working on now. So the way that I've been trying to navigate that is again just sort of carving out space on my own, not explicitly saying this is what I'm doing. It's more like I kind of tell people the bandwidth that I have for the project I'm being assigned to, and I personally carve out space to do this work, but I don't tell people that's what the work I'm doing right now because someone might see that, and I hopefully my managers don't hear this podcast, but someone might see that and be like, oh well, that's not on the roadmap. That's not necessarily a priority right now. So let's go ahead and shift something like that. So it still kind of feels like you have to sort of do it without permission in order to get permission. Like, I know that's not a great answer, but it's sort of the only one that I have right now, other than.
No, I think there's something there though. Like give yourself some space to innovate, right? Like create that space for a little bit where you have this time to experiment and explore a little bit. And it's not necessarily just about what's what's in your sprint or whatever. It's about kind of what you feel like you maybe need to do to positively affect the whole organization or the whole advance the whole design system.
Yeah, and it still feels that's still very much in like the crawl paradigm I was speaking of. That's still going to be very slow moving process. And unfortunately, until you get the actual buy-in, the process is probably going to be slow because in order for it to speed up, you truly do need your runway cleared for a bit. You need to have true like real space to work, and that may not be something you can get without having at least your immediate manager be like, okay, here's dedicated time to work on this.
Yeah, it's a little hard to go completely like cowboy rogue and just start doing the stuff that you want to do instead of the stuff that your manager says is the priority.
Yeah, I mean, you could try it, but I don't know how well that'll work out for you in the end.
Yeah, definitely. Might be career
Yeah.
limiting. So tell me a little bit more about this idea of components, right? You mentioned earlier that components aren't the goal of a design system. So many people that we have conversations with talk about how it's just a race to get components out the door, like components, components, components. And there's this, I would say, pervasive attitude that a finished design system is a design system with a lot of components that do a lot of different things. Now, I don't necessarily believe that that's true because I think that, yeah, components are important, but fundamentally it's a lot more about people and process. And I'd really love to hear your take on
Yeah, I'm
this.
not entirely sure like how the idea that components are like the end all be all design system. I'm not sure where that idea came from, but I think it's a very limiting way of looking at design systems. And it's also part of the reason why there's a certain set of people who think that design systems are basically just like style guides or just like or UI kits or something like that because that's the only artifacts that they see from design systems. They see the components on the beautifully documented website. All they see is that part of it and they assume that's all that they need. But what you don't see is like how does a design concept get into the design system? Like what kind of research do you do or to see how do you decide what to build in the first place. I've seen like a lot of design systems that are all about components have a component for literally like everything. When in reality, your design system should only include the stuff you need to use. So some design systems, the actual component section of it might be sort of very small because their UI isn't that complicated. But maybe
Mhm.
all of the documentation behind, how their coding standards or their visual language might be more robust than that.
Gotcha. And so, I think that maybe this is a symptom of us all kind of viewing the big ripples of a design system as something that we look at through our own lens, right? If you're a developer, you may feel like components is the goal. If you're a designer, you may think like a really robust set of design files is the goal. But really, it's not any one of those individual things. And as a coder yourself, you probably think about components a lot when it's about a design system and maybe a little less about design files. I don't know. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think that we all kind of tend to view this through our own personal lens. And maybe components is a way that certain people are able to make sense of this really complex object that you have in front of you being a
I
design
think
system.
so. I also think that because design system, like pretty much anything software based, it's not a very tangible thing. Like components feel like the closest tangible like artifact you have of it, so it's very
Yeah.
easy to latch on to that part of it because you can very clearly see the wide range of components you have, and that's one way to measure your design system to show like here's all the things we built, all the components we built. It's harder to be like we also established a common visual language between design and engineering where we're all referring to pieces of our UI the same way. And it's harder to talk about those more people oriented improvements that happen.
Yeah, I can point at a line of code, but I can't point at the fact that we all call that line of
Yeah,
code the same thing.
exactly. Like this one part of the website, like, is it a modal or is it a pop up or is it a light box? Like the very
Right.
idea, like something so simple that we all refer to that thing as the exact same thing. And it feels like a very small thing, but it's also a very big and powerful thing to break down the barriers between the various organizations, like built the breaking down the barriers between design and engineering and pretty much everyone else, like non-technical people. Like the fact that we can all have a shared language is a very powerful thing, I think.
So pulling on that thread of shared language a little bit, we talk a lot about this as a part of our consulting work where we say a shared language is important, but it's very often difficult to get organizations to understand that you're not just building a shared language when you're saying that a carousel is a carousel and not a film strip, or a card is a card and not a tile. you're actually building this sort of shared culture around these components, around these concepts that you use to build your digital products, your websites, your apps. Talk to me a little bit more about the foundations of this culture and how it goes for you beyond this shared
So
language.
the building like a culture around like the design system and the various artifacts, I found that that common language has let me collaborate cross-functionally and across organizations in a much better way. Once I was able to establish a shared language based on the Pantsuit Design System at Hillary for America, the collaboration between myself and the designers that I was working with seemed to like kind of skyrocket and seemed to we kind of streamlined a lot of the process just by being able to quickly understand the point someone else was trying to make. We didn't have to have, back and forths about a certain design mock or about something else. We were able to cut out a lot of the, I don't want to say middleman, but a lot of like the cruft that gets in the way. An example, a story that I love to tell is that Victor Ng, who was the lead web designer on Hillary for America campaign, he sometimes when we had to make tweaks to the website, which in turn meant we were making tweaks to Pantsuit, the design system, he would frequently just sit down next to me, literally draw wireframes, and I would code them right then. Like we skipped an entire like mock process. We skipped the entire like going into Sketch, which was what we used at the time, going into Sketch and doing that. It went straight from like his brain to code, which was kind of cool. So like
That's
having that
awesome.
process in place, like having a design system in place wouldn't made that particular process possible because otherwise it would have been a lot of like miscommunication probably in the mix.
Yeah, and I think that idea of that shared culture around that product, like that really solidifies the ability for people to collaborate in that way, because it's really hard when there's a wall between people, that there's that lack of understanding. It goes beyond language. I think language is a big part of it, but just understanding how people work together and how people work really effectively. And in something like a presidential campaign, that's invaluable because you have to respond really quickly, like one news cycle, and all of a sudden everything has to be different, right? So that agility that you guys got from that seems like a really powerful tool for building this thing really
Yeah, that
quickly.
is actually the point that I tend to harp on a lot about the benefits of design system is that it really does let you streamline a lot of your process. And that is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that fact is usually what gets the higher ups interested is the fact that hey, I can launch something in a day or two versus like waiting for a 2 week like dev cycle. Like that kind of is the mind blowing aspect of it. I kind of tell you a little anecdote about Slack and like the current state of the world. Once self shelter in place started happening and a lot of people started trying to figure out how to work remotely, Slack obviously is a powerful tool to help that, and so we completely pivoted what we were working on. My team is called customer acquisition, and what we do is slack.com. We run the marketing aspect on the web for Slack, and so
Hmm.
our team does a lot of like the education behind like the benefits of using Slack and trying to get new people to use it. So it was kind of our team's focus shifted a lot to putting out resources for how to work remotely and how to like do how to use Slack to help empower remote work. And so we had to start cranking out resources like on 1 or 2 days notice. And without the foundation of the design system that we had built a couple years ago, like that would not have been possible. We would not have been able to crank out these resources as quickly as the world demanded them from us.
Yeah, and I mean, who could have said that you would need to all of a sudden have a third of the U.S. workforce work out of their houses like overnight? And I think the ability to respond to that is an incredibly powerful story for a design system, right? Because now all of a sudden you're not necessarily saying like, hey, I got to go put out information about a pandemic, but I have to change my message from one of like, let's get this into the four walls of an office to let's get this into people's homes. And I think that's a big shift that would normally take an organization months or even a year to really
Yeah,
undergo.
it was very kind of serendipitous, I guess is the best term for it, where we had this foundation in place that really allowed us to take advantage of these tools that we already had in place to help us to empower our users, our stakeholders, the marketing team who was trying to pivot what they were doing immediately. Like we were able to truly help empower them to do their jobs better.
So talking a little bit more about Pantsuit, I would just have loved to have been a fly on the wall when you guys were naming that design system. How did that
Uh,
conversation go down? I'm really curious about this because I think it's a brilliant name. I just I want to understand, like, how did, like, when you guys were sitting there, like, were you guys around a pot of coffee at like 1 o'clock in the morning, like sitting there throwing names on a whiteboard? How did this go down?
okay. I will take full responsibility slash credit for this because it really just came from me. Um, the way that it happened was I was asked to build quote unquote a bootstrap for the campaign, and after I built it and I was showing it to, at the time we had a very small tech team, it was like maybe 5 or 6 of us, so I was showing it to our director of front end and a couple of other engineers. They're like, yeah, this is cool. And so then the director of front end looks at me. He's like, okay, so we got to name it now. What's the name of this thing? And so I was still pretty self conscious in that scenario. Like, still couldn't quite believe I was working there. So I was kind of like, I didn't want. I thought it was a stupid idea, to be perfectly honest. Like, it had been kicking around in my head for like maybe a couple of weeks at that point. And so when he asked, I took a deep breath. I'm like, okay, I have an idea. I don't know if it's a good one or a bad one. I kind of hemmed and hawed for a bit of like, how about we call it Pantsuit? And literally, they all had been like, twitching and like doing kind of like, they all had been like shifting in their seats. Everyone stopped moving. They all looked at me, and I thought, crap, this is a bad idea. They're all mad at me, and they're like, oh my god, that's fucking brilliant. Yes, we're calling it that. I was like, oh my god, yes.
So great. I can't imagine the anxiety of holding on to that for 2 weeks while you were waiting for that meeting too. That's
Yeah,
great.
just because it had been in my head, I'm like, I feel like this is the name. I couldn't come up with anything that felt better or felt more appropriate. So I was like, I think this is it, but I can't tell if it's a good or a bad idea.
Yeah. What did
I
Hillary think
honestly
of the
don't
name?
know she knows the name, to be perfectly honest. Like, it wasn't something that we spoke about because I've met her exactly twice, and it wasn't like that was something I told her, and I don't know if anyone else ever told her. So I don't know.
Yeah, for all of you that tweeted me questions about what's Hillary Clinton like in real life, like we can't get there. We can't get there on this
Nope.
podcast today. Well, sorry,
Nope.
guys.
But yeah, I honestly have no idea if she was ever informed of if the fact that we had a design system, what the name of it was. I would imagine she had more important things on her mind. So yeah.
Yeah, I can, like, I definitely understand why she would. Well, that actually leads me to another interesting question. How did you get in that position? You'd done a lot of work prior to the Clinton campaign. Design systems were still relatively new, if not pretty revolutionary in 2016 and 2015. And so how did you find yourself in that situation, and what really brought you there? And I kind of want to try to understand, the evolution of your thinking around how this all works. Because we all kind of have our first design system story, if you will, kind of like our first kiss or whatever, right? I'm very curious to hear how you ended up in the place that you
Oh
are now.
wow. So how I ended up on the Hillary campaign and how I got into design systems are slightly related, but I I got onto the campaign because it was like the classic networking story. I've met someone at a conference. Can't remember exactly which one or when we met, but I met the director of front end for Obama's campaign in 2012. And he and I connected, kind of stayed close. And when it came time for Hillary's campaign to start trying to build out a tech team, they approached him. It's like, hey, tech people. Who do you got? And he gave my name as amongst other people's names. And so that was how I got introduced to her campaign. From there, it was a normal like interview and hiring process. And once I got in the office, I was actually approached and asked to build the design system. We didn't call it that because I don't think that was a phrase that I had heard for a while. Or
Right.
yeah,
It
I don't
wasn't a
think that
name
was a
at that
name at
point.
that point.
Yeah.
But I happened to be like I was the first actual engineer hired. I should say that. So like I was hired directly by the CTO of the campaign, and so there was a very small team when I got to Brooklyn in the office. It was me, the director of front end that was hired shortly after me, and like I think maybe 2 or 3 other engineers. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, I was the only person there who was really any good at CSS. Like that was kind of my strongest skill set at that time. And so they were like, you're the most appropriate person for us. We need this thing. and you're the most appropriate person to build it. Do you think you can build this thing? I never built anything like that before. I'd seen style
Mm-hmm.
guides. I'd seen, Bootstrap and Foundation, which were the big like ones at the time. And I was like, I know what you're talking about. I'm pretty sure I know how the process would work, but yeah, sure, I'll do it. That's fine. So I was given this like really amazing opportunity to kind of build something on my own that to this day, I'm not entirely sure why he trusted me to do that because he had no knowledge, just no reason to think I'd be getting good at it. I should say that. Like there was nothing to back up the fact that I should be able to do something like this, other than the fact that I know how to write CSS.
Seems like a big hairy risk on both sides, right? Like the idea of like, hey, go build this thing that, by the way, is kind of revolutionary, and then hey, also like go accept this job where like you're kind of the only person that can build this thing.
Yeah. I mean, eventually, of course, we built out the tech team, and we had more people who could have done it and would have done it well as well. But the fact that I was there at the time that they needed it was really how it came to be. Like it was a lot of it was just sort of luck and being in the moment, like being there in the moment.
That's really
Yeah.
cool. And this was the first time you'd been involved in politics? You hadn't done organizing or anything like that
No,
before?
I had never been involved in politics at all. I had been involved with, sort of with community-oriented things, particularly tech community-oriented things. Like at the time, had did Girl Development, so I was a teacher for Girl Development, which is a nonprofit that encourages women to get into technology and teaches them how to code. So I had done that at the time for maybe about a year or so. And so that was partially why Dan Ryan, who was the director for Obama's front end in 2012, that was partially why he thought of me because he knew that I had done community work before. And so he thought that that kind of work, that interest would then translate to me wanting to do something that was for like the greater good or for like more mission oriented type work.
When the Hillary campaign came to an end, then that was when you started to look elsewhere. So what was your kind of next step
The
after
next
that?
step after that was to take a big break. um,
I'm sure it was intense.
yeah. I mean, I had planned on taking time off post campaign, regardless of the outcome. But given the outcome that we had, I definitely needed a mental break. So I actually didn't do anything. I didn't work for about 4 months, which was as long as my bank account told me I can go without work. And I took some.
I've been in those positions before.
Yeah, so I did nothing for a bit. And it felt great to kind of decompress and recharge. But when I started looking for my next move, my next job, I was in a really fortunate position due to the visibility I had working for her. A lot of people came to me. A lot of opportunities sort of like came to me that I probably wouldn't have found out about or seen before. One of them was Slack. Someone who used to work at Slack, Erica Baker, she DM'd me. It was like, "Hey, so whenever you're ready to look for a job, you should look at this company Slack that I work at. It sounds like it's a great place. I think you would like it." And so I started the interview process with them while I was on vacation in Hong Kong. That was a great experience. Yeah, I did a video call with the the recruiter when I was actually in Hong Kong. Yeah, that was fun. But yeah,
Wow.
I started that interview process with them, and as I started going, I had a few opportunities come my way, but Slack seemed to be the one that seemed like the best fit for me. So once I was ready to start working, I had a lot to choose from, which was an experience I've never quite had before.
So I know you already can't send this podcast to your manager, but if I had to think about like what was next, are you going to be involved in the Biden campaign? Are you going back to the fray in politics? Or are you gonna stick around the company that's replacing email for a
I'm
while?
gonna stick around Slack for a while. I know a few people who are on the Biden campaign. I wish nothing but the best for them, but it's just not a thing that I can do again. It takes a lot out of you, and it requires a great deal of commitment, and I just don't know if I have it in me right now.
Yeah, totally. I have lots of friends that have worked on some campaigns before, and they say usually either get one or get all of the ones from there on out.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a really awesome story. I know that you basically said, hey, I was building this thing that nobody knew what to call it. I totally remember that same feeling working for Red Hat a while ago, where we were building this like repeatable UI, this repeatable front end, and we just weren't quite sure what to call it. What really led you to this community of design
So it
systems?
started probably years before with actually with the SaaS community, strangely enough. Gina Ann, who is a great friend of mine, of course, she is a kind of powerhouse in both the SaaS community and in the design systems community. And so I had been sort of following her work before I knew her, and she had been talking about like style guides and things like that for a long time. So it kind of slowly transitioned from an interest in style guides and style tiles to quote, I believe it's Samantha Toy, and then sort of very similar artifacts around organizing visual languages and visual UI. So it kind of like slowly, organically progressed into this interest in the thing that we call design systems, where first it was just let's make a style guide so that we have a good idea of we can very easily document the style for our website. And then it was front end frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation and similar component libraries. So it's kind of like just a very gradual interest in these things. And suddenly people started calling them design system and started calling the term design system became this big like buzz phrase. And the work that I had been doing suddenly had a new name and suddenly everyone was interested in it. And it just felt very odd that I'd been doing this stuff for a while, just not calling it that or not thinking about it in that very specific framework. So
That's super funny. So I didn't realize we had that common connection. So I know you're a big Twitter person, and I'm not really. So I've always known Samantha Toy as Samantha Warren. I used to work with Samantha back in agency land and doing the style tiles thing and everything like that. And there was a very similar sort of origin to kind of how I was thinking about it as well, right? Like we were looking at all of these ideas of like, how do you create these reused pieces of a website? And she also was a very big influencer of my early
yeah,
beginnings.
I remember when I first saw that concept of style tiles, I was so excited about them because I was like, "This is really cool. This is right up my alley." Allow because I was at the time I was just sort of getting my feet into web development. I have a actual background as a designer. I worked as a designer for the first few years of my career. So style tiles was like this interesting way for me to sort of start bridging the gap, like bridging this gap between my interest in front end and my background as a designer. So that's also why I got into what we know as design systems and why I love them so much is that they allow me to utilize these two skill sets that I love so much.
Well, hey, Mina, I just want to say thank you again for being on the program today. It's been really great to chat with you, get a little bit more insight into your background, what brought you here, and also talk a little about what really is at the core of culture inside of a design system. So thank you very, very much for being with us. I really can't express my appreciation enough.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun and we had a great talk.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.